I'm Sam Gindin. I spent most of my working life with the Canadian Auto Workers, about 27 years. And then I taught at York for about a decade, a course on social justice and political activism, and left that to concentrate on the book that Leo Panitch and I, who've been friends for 50 years, I think this month, have just completed on the Making of Global Capitalism.
So your new book seems organized around the idea that the state is far more essential actor in managing global capitalism than is often discussed, and more specifically that the U.S. state is the preeminent manager of imperialism. What's the intervention you're trying to make in how the left analyzes global capitalism?
Well, I think one of the things we're trying to emphasize is that there's a structural tendency in capitalism to go global, and Marx emphasized that back in 1848. But it doesn't mean that they can actually achieve it. And if you looked at the first half of the 19th century, you had two wars, a depression, conflict over dividing Africa, etc. So it actually looked, getting through the Second World War, that maybe globalization wasn't possible. A lot of people thought, hey, this proves it isn't possible. And so the question is, what made it possible? And what made it possible was the intervention of the American state. We have to understand the American state as an agency. And in terms of our analysis of this, we have to understand that the American state created a new kind of empire. This wasn't just, I'm the new kid on the block and now I'm taking over and I'm going to have all the colonies. This was actually a state that said that we want to move towards an open world economy where there are no empires. So we want to actually dismantle those empires, and we want to have a world of sovereign states. States will exist, but the world will be open to capital accumulation. And that's a unique kind of empire that's never been built before. And this is what the American state built. Now, I think why it's so important is some people think that global companies bypass states. Well, in fact, what's happened is that global companies depend on more states. They depend on many states. And some people think that states are victims of globalization. We'd be nicer to you except for globalization. But when you study this, you see that they're actually the authors of it. They've been doing the active things to make globalization. So for us, it's important to understand that once you see that states are at the center of this, it also affects the politics. It means that if globalization is made by states, and globalization is global capitalism, it's not just a technical globalization, it's not just companies getting bigger, it's particular social relations that this is part of. The unmaking of globalization and global capitalism is going to require addressing the state. Not just protests, not just lobbying, but thinking about how do we transform states? Because the kind of states that we have, although they have a certain autonomy from capital, they don't, capital doesn't just call them up on the phone and tells them what to do because there's different interests, they don't know quite what to do. And the state is able to kind of sit back and think more about what does the system need? See the forest, not just the trees. And so on the one hand, it's got some autonomy from capital. So some people just think that, well, if we just elect somebody else, everything will change. But on the other hand, that's only relative. It's always dependent on corporations for jobs, for revenue. So it's always limited by capital. So it's a capitalist state. All its capacities have developed for the purpose of strengthening capitalism and strengthening the system. And if we're going to change things, we have to think of transforming that state. And this is a really major project. Again, it's not just protest, it's not just lobbying, it's actually thinking about how do you take state power and then invent the kind of a state that can help you collectively to democratize society.
How's the most recent crisis in capitalism, started in 2007, changed the historical arc of the development of U.S. imperialism and the U.S. state?
I think actually what's striking is the fact that it hasn't at a lot of levels. In other words, what you actually see is neoliberalism continuing, austerity continuing, them actually seeing this as a chance to hammer the public sector, unions, which are the only ones left standing. Inequality is still growing. The banks are being bailed out and they're restructuring, becoming more concentrated and even more powerful. So at one level, you don't see a lot of changes. And the real crisis, in a sense, that comes out of this isn't a crisis of capitalism. There's questions about its legitimacy, etc. But the shocking thing is that we've gone through this kind of a crisis where nobody can blame ordinary people for causing it. And yet the right is basically coming out of this untouched. It's still unions and working people who are on the defensive through this. And that's kind of amazing. So one of the things that you see coming out of this crisis is the extent to which, how weak we are. And that's kind of the challenge. And because we're weak, that kind of suggests that the arc isn't going to be changed, because the arc will depend on us actually changing that arc. You don't, for example, when you look at this, free trade, you'd think that in a really deep crisis, well, maybe free trade would break down. There'd be much more conflict as everybody protects themselves. We haven't seen that. You think that there might be capital controls given financial volatility. We haven't seen that. These are quite amazing things, and it shows how integrated the system is and how the U.S. still plays that leadership role. In spite of this being an American crisis, capital is flowing in, and that gives it the ability to play a particular role in managing the crisis. So what strikes me is we've seen a lot more capacity on the part of the American state, what the Federal Reserve has done to pump in money and to prevent a total financial collapse. But what we've seen is how strong they are in terms of continuing where they're going. We haven't reversed that, in spite of, obviously there's going to be tensions, but nothing seems to be reversing.
Your book challenges the standard narrative of U.S. imperialism and global capitalism in decline. How has the role and standing of the U.S. changed relative to the rest of the world, and in particular the strengthening BRIC countries?
Yeah. It's really important when you think about things like decline that you think about the larger context of what you're measuring. So, for example, if somebody says, well, what are you talking about? In 1950, the U.S. had 50% of industrial production. Now it's under 25%. Doesn't that prove it's in decline? Well, if you just look at those kinds of measures, yes, those kinds of national comparisons. But if you think of this as an empire, and that what the U.S. was really trying to do after the war was make a global capitalism. In other words, spread it. Rebuild Europe, rebuild Japan, and then think about how to integrate the third world in a new way. That becomes a measure of its strength, the fact that it's spread. So what you have is capitalism is now spread much wider, including to parts it was excluded from, like Soviet Union and China, which does create more competitors, but it also creates way, way more opportunities. The coming of China means that MNCs have this whole world to move into. India, Brazil. And what's fascinating is that in the 70s, for example, you had all kinds of you had liberation movements, you had national movements, you had China and Russia and the Soviet Union outside of this. Today, the communist countries are basically integrated. Cuba's kind of trying to survive without it. And there's almost no country in the world who's talking about leaving capitalism, including the BRICS. So from that perspective of capitalism has spread and others have shared in it, the U.S. doesn't have the same share of production that it had before. But in terms of the whole becoming so much larger and so much accepting capitalism, that's the sense in which it's so much stronger. And part of this has been constantly, it's not an inevitable thing. This could not happen. It's an empirical question. Part of it has been that the American state and the American social formation in terms of business and finance has shown that it's got the dynamic capacity to keep changing and adjusting to reproduce its leadership role. Ever since Europe and Japan recovered, there's been this notion of decline. And there was always somebody who's about to replace the U.S. And it was always an illusion. It was Germany or Europe, and then it was Japan, and then it was Southeast Asia and the NICs, and now it's China. And so there's a couple of ways of looking at it. One is to understand, I think the main thing is to understand that China has its own problems in terms of reproducing itself, in terms of this transition to modernizing its economy. And the model of growth that it's chosen to do that, was really decided that it would be by integrating itself into global capitalism. And it became more integrated into global capitalism than any other country that was a late developer, far more. So, and that meant it's integrating itself into a world in which it depends on American leadership. It depends on the markets everywhere that American state can make sure remain open, the U.S. market, but all markets. It depends on stability of oil, which the U.S. takes most responsibility for. It depends on technology from the West. It depends on foreign investors coming in. So it's remarkably integrated, as one point, into this world. Now, it does mean that China is more powerful. It's a bigger player within it, and it demands that it be recognized as such. So there's always some tensions about this, but it's really integrated into that world, and especially in terms of finance. For it, if you try to if you ask the question, well, could China play the role that America plays in terms of managing crises and dealing with European finance and dealing with global finance? Well, it can't, because it doesn't have financial markets. The Communist Party, the leadership, controls financial markets there. It's a little bit of openings, but it controls them. And to give that up would be very risky for it, because that's what it uses to reproduce itself. That's what it uses to determine where do the funds go to, what sectors do they go to, and how do they maintain control, because otherwise who needs them really if it's just going to be a capitalist society. So the liberalization of finance isn't going to happen. So you have to ask this in terms of what changes would have to happen within China for it to actually be a different kind of society, and that would be almost a revolution inside of China. So right now our argument is that the integration of China is an indication of American strength, that China wants and needs to be in American global capitalism. And there will be tensions, but none of those tensions are about actually challenging American leadership, which China doesn't want the responsibilities and the burdens even of taking that on. I should say something about some of the stuff that comes up in this, because it came up in the debate last night as well. The argument is that we have to get China to raise its currency, and that'll make us more competitive. That's simply not true. If China raises its currency, it just means somebody else in Southeast Asia will outcompete China. A lot of those goods America isn't producing already. The problems in the U.S. about jobs are problems that have to be dealt with inside the U.S., and that's something maybe we can come back to later.
So you argue that the U.S. state manages global capitalism on behalf of the global capitalist class, but without always the direct involvement and intervention of that class. What's the logic of global capitalism that it's managing and implementing on its own, and if it's changed, how so?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is a powerful logic to capitalism. It's competing. Capitalists compete, and that drives all kinds of changes. So one of the most significant things in the post-war period is that the international dimension of this isn't just marginal. The international dimension of this has become fundamental. So, for example, one of the ways you see this is it isn't just global companies deciding to trade, and it isn't even them just going into another country and setting up new operations. It's now integrated production. It's now parts are flowing from all over the world. You look at an iPad. It's designed and the research and development is in the U.S., but the components are made in Japan or all over Asia and assembled in China. So production has actually become integrated, which means it's a more tightly integrated world. The other dimension of this is you can't actually have a global economy where you've got different exchange rates and different risks involved without financial markets. So the growth of finance, global finance, it's always been a crucial part of capitalism, but its explosion is really linked to that globalization, and it furthers it. So that's another way it's really changed. And it isn't that finance and industry are in conflict, as people think. They're mutually interdependent, and they need each other. Now, in terms of the question of the states, the change that takes place in terms of states is that, there's a question of, well, how did these states come to not just represent their own businesses? And and it's a really important question. And what it involved is the internationalization of those states. And what we mean by that is that national states came to take responsibility inside their own borders for global capitalism and to sign international treaties that linked up with, that made the world safer for global capitalism. And that's a really important development. So, for example, Canada has a crisis in the auto industry. The main producers are GM, Ford, and Chrysler, and it's GM, Ford, and they are giving loan guarantees or subsidies to GM, Ford, and Chrysler, especially GM and Chrysler, obviously, in that period. So the Canadian state is itself actually taking responsibility for GM and Chrysler, American companies, because it has to, because its economy also depends on it. So this internationalization of states has been very important. So you see this drive of capitalism to go international and to integrate production and, as Marx said, to nestle everywhere, settle everywhere. But there's a problem because markets don't just operate on their own. You need to break down barriers, they need guarantees, they need contracts, they want particular kind of labor laws. And also competition can get quite chaotic. You have to have rules. You can't just have somebody competing by saying, I'm just going to go shoot my competitor or whatever. So states are very fundamental to actually making these markets. And what states then had to do was make these markets internationally, which begins to mean treaties, and then treaties that you sign a treaty and it's like a constitution for your own country. You can't now change it by law. So that's how all these things are related.
You've said that the role of the labor movement in the U.S. has been critical in how the U.S. states developed. Can you explain what you mean?
Yeah. When you analyze capitalism, you have to bring class in, and not just as a victim. One of our criticisms of a lot of Marxist theory is when it just speaks in terms of laws, without recognizing, the role of class and class conflict in them, or only tendentially recognizing them. A law of the falling rate of profit, for example, which we've been critical of, or that there's one law that leads to crises all the time. So where class is very important is, if you look at the New Deal, when you have the Depression and the working class organizes and resists, before the New Deal, the American state was very small. So the American state actually develops new capacities. It begins to, you get the beginning of welfare state in terms of social programs in response to this militancy, of labor legislation which allows organizing, of all kinds of programs of job creation, Tennessee Valley Authority. So you actually had, I can't remember offhand the numbers, but a multiple expansion of the number of federal employees and departments. So you're beginning to develop new kinds of state capacities to do something. Now those get channeled into operating within the system as they regain some control. So in the 30s you have that. After the war, labor again is coming out of the war with some strength. Labor's always stronger after the war because people have been making sacrifices and they expect some equality. And you've had relatively close to full employment in the States during the war, which gives labor some strength. So after the war, the question is, well, how are you going to integrate this labor movement that now has high expectations? It's kind of suppressed them through the Depression and through the war. And what they tried to do, what they channeled this into was productivism, that workers would be able to make gains as individuals, and you'd have growth, but you would divert workers from challenging the distribution of power, private property, the distribution of income. And that again involved the state. It introduced the Taft-Hartley law and introduced limits on unions. It was part of attacking the left, particularly the communist left, which had all kinds of repercussions. Once they attacked that left, they attacked the left as a whole. So the state again was involved in also controlling and restraining labor, but also channeling it into a particular direction, a particular individual. And you actually see the cradle of neoliberalism is in this period. So you have that. And then in the 70s, when you have a lot of economic militancy and it's affecting profit rates, it's affecting the value of the dollar because of inflation, again, you see the state responding. And that's when, what we now call neoliberalism really gets realized. They decide to raise interest rates, let unemployment rise, to weaken labor. And then you begin to see further changes in the states. Now, one of the things that how people describe it, which is wrong, is that after the early 80s and with neoliberalism, the state begins to pull itself out of society. That's not true. What's happening is that the state is changing what it does. So it does try to cut back on social programs, but it's building more prisons. It's more involved in limiting labor. It's more involved in trying to get international treaties. It's more involved in trying to open up other markets. It's more involved in managing crises because it does come to the conclusion that capitalism is a kind of dynamic system that actually you can't stop crises, and they're actually functional in some ways. So you just have to figure out how to contain them. So you actually have a more active state. It's very it's silly to think of the American state as a weak state.
What levels of analysis are still missing about how capitalism functions today? What other analyses are needed for social movements to transform global capitalism?
Yeah, great question. In terms of our book, I think we try to develop a framework for thinking about global capitalism that really brings states in and the imperial state in, but also brings in some political economy. And so I think that there's a lot more work to be done in terms of understanding crises and how each crisis is different from the previous one. Because whenever you have a crisis, something often changes, and that makes the next crisis different. So that, I think understanding crises. I think there's a lot of things missing from our book around the military, the CIA, and we did that partly because we think it's important to understand that the nature of this empire is a specifically capitalist empire that tries to do things through economic institutions, through markets. And the military is important to prevent people either trying to leave capitalism or when sometimes you're trying to create those markets. But it's important for the purpose of making markets. But we think there's a lot of work still to be done around that. There's a lot of work to be done in more detail about the state. How does the state work? What does the Department of Labor do? What does the Department of Welfare do? How does that integrate people? What does the Department of Housing do? I mean, one of the things we did talk a lot about was how the housing crisis actually goes back to the 70s when people were complaining, women and then especially blacks, about their lack of access to housing. And because public housing was blocked off as an alternative, the only solution was you had to integrate people into financial markets. And that's when you begin to see blacks themselves fighting for, that's the only option that they see, getting access, women getting access to credit, blacks getting access to housing. And the Clinton administration is really proud of supporting that, but so was Bush. And that dependence on private housing ends up to also be a problem. So there's all those things to think about. I think one thing that's really important to think about for movements, though, is at another level, and that's to understand how is it, given what's happened to people over the past quarter of a century, given the increase in inequality, the increase in insecurity, the narrowing of people's lives to things like, are you competitive? Can you survive? When, the productivity in this economy has more than doubled since the 80s. There's more than twice as many goods around. How is it that people have accepted this? And that's, I think, a different kind of question. Well, and it's not just a psychological question. It's a question about how were they materially integrated? Like workers maintain their consumption by working, their spouses working longer hours or by going into debt. Workers look to their pensions as, if the stock market goes up, maybe that'll give me my pension. So you begin to, people just adjusted. They began to live at home longer. And I think that works all the way through. How did people, on the one hand, get integrated? On the other hand, how did they get fragmented? Workers resenting the poor because they're paying taxes and they're thinking, why am I paying it to this guy? And the poor saying, look at this guy's pretty well off. If he takes a little bit less, so what? So how was the working class fragmented? How was it integrated? What role did competition play? Because once you really accept the logic of competition, it's pitting you against other workers and uniting you with your boss. And it's accepting all kinds of other policies, you know, protectionism, racism, all kinds of things. So I think there's something really important to take a look at all of those things, because I think one of the mistakes we make is our rhetoric is full of how they're attacking us. And if they were just attacking us, it would just be a question of, well, we hate them and let's fight back. But it's also that we've been integrated. We've kind of helped, you know, I think a lot of working people have been part of reproducing neoliberalism because they've learned out of necessity, because they want to survive, to play the game as individuals. I want a tax break. You know, I want my pension. Or even as a union, I want to protect my members. And we have to study that to understand it better. The fragmentation, the isolation, the integration, all those things that happen to the people in the movements and in the unions. I think that's a fundamental thing. I guess the main thing I'd say about it is, if we want to change the world, not just complain about it or even protest it, if we want to really change it, we have to understand it. And understanding it is difficult. And it's also sobering, because when you try to understand it, you actually see how complex it is. But otherwise, we're dreaming. We have to understand how complex it is so we know what we're up against. And it's part of the argument against declinism. A lot of people think that if you push that the American empire is in decline, somehow that helps you mobilize. And it might make you feel good. Hey, those guys aren't... But you're underestimating their strength. And what we have to recognize is that we're fighting an empire that's very strong, not just militarily, but strong in terms of, somebody said, having outposts in our head. It's very strong that way. And if we understand how strong it is, it affects how we organize. Because it does raise the question, which I guess you're going to get to, if we're just organizing around a single issue, can you possibly win, given what you're really fighting? You know, you might, it's good, you're defending people, you have to do that, but it gives you a different perspective on what needs to be done.
The role and function of finance capital, it seems to me, is one key area of capitalism that we don't actually fully even understand how it operates yet.
Yeah.
And that plays a significant role in then understanding anything that we can do about it, or challenges that we can organize people to fight against. Can you say something about that?
No, good point. I should have mentioned that when you were asking me about what needs to be studied. We try to spend a lot of time studying finance. You can't avoid it if you're leading up to this crisis. So yes, understanding finance is very important, and it does raise this question of, how is it that finance is at the center of this crisis, which screws up people's lives, and it screws up business too, and it gets away with it? And, you know, is it just that presidents like Wall Street? Like, what is it? And to understand that, you have to understand that industry actually needs finance. So it doesn't like the volatility, it doesn't like the crises, it doesn't like the craziness, but it needs it. And if it tries to control it, it'll, you know, it's like killing the goose that laid the golden egg for them. They need finance to operate globally.